And inflation has remained within the 5% to 6% range, with June only seeing a rate of 0.1% from 5.1% from 5.2% in May. And joining me now to unpack the contributing factors of the figures in a greater detail is Chief Economist at RMB, Isaah Mhlanga. Thank you so much for your time, Isaah. Yeah, inflation has actually been in that range of 5 to 6% for quite a while now. It is encouraging, obviously, to see the cooling down, even though it is gradual. But would you not say that it's taking too long to get to that 4.5% target, mid-range of the target?
Indeed, it's taking too long, but this is not unique to South Africa. We have seen sticky inflation across the world in most major economies. So we're really following global trends, but it's encouraging that we have seen an edge down of the headline inflation to 5.1% after 2 consecutive months of printing at 5.2%. What is also encouraging is if you look at core inflation, that excludes the volatile components of food and non-alcoholic beverages, fuel, and energy. You also see that it moderated to 4.5%. So this is the first time it has hit 4.5% since the third quarter of 2023. So that is an encouraging development. And then if you look at the components across the board, most components moderated, except for a few, in fact, except for just 2.
Yeah.
Restaurants and hotels, where we saw an increase to 7.2% on a year-on-year basis. And then we also had, food and alcoholic beverages that moderated. If you look at one other component where we saw a significant increase, household contents and services. So if you take the household contents and services and then restaurant and hotels, those are the 2 components that saw an increase. All the other ones, they actually moderated, which says it's a broad-based decline in inflation that we saw, which we hope is going to be continued in the months to come.
How do you actually feel about that, food inflation versus services inflation? Because I understand that there had been a concern for a while that as much as we are seeing moderation in goods services, rather, that services would remain a little bit sticky.
Indeed, services tend to remain a bit sticky. More in line with the core inflation. They don't react as much to changing conditions, at least not immediately. And that's really the underlying inflation in the economy. Is very correlated to what you see in core. But if you look at food, we've had concerns about El Nino and what that would mean for food price inflation. That risk remain, given the drought issues in the region, but also in South Africa in particular, where the concern about potential harvest of grain, which are likely to decline by at a minimum of 20% relative to last season. So all of that poses upside risk to inflation. But for now, we think inflation will continue to moderate.
All right. And lastly, just as we wrap up the conversation, Isaah, what then do these dynamics and this picture of inflation then suggest for the thesis that you have? What thesis does it support in terms of what the South African Reserve Bank could do with monetary policy going forward, at least in the short term?
We think the South African Reserve Bank is concerned about inflation expectations a lot more. And if you look at inflation expectations, they're still way above the midpoint of 4.5%. They're likely to wait until inflation expectations moderate closer to the 4.5%. And if you look at the behavior of inflation expectations, they're essentially backward-looking, which means economic agents want to see a moderation in inflation first before they actually believe that it is going to continue to moderate. So given that, we would expect another 2 or 3 prints of inflation that shows a moderation to drive inflation expectations towards 4.5%. And as a result, we still think the first rate cut is likely to come in November and not in September, precisely because inflation expectations remain well above the 4.5%, but also the incoming print of actual inflation, as we saw today, 5.1%, it's still, again, well above the 4.5%.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and giving us insights on that inflation picture, Isaah. That was Chief Economist at RMB, Isaah Mhlanga.